At 12:47 p.m. on June 10, 2020, a single gunshot shattered more than just the afternoon silence in Denver's Ballpark neighborhood. It shattered the life of a 21-year-old woman whose only crime was walking her dog. It shattered a family's faith in justice. And it shattered the carefully constructed lies that protect those who are supposed to protect us. Isabella Thallas died because a police officer gave a military-grade assault rifle to a man with a history of violence and mental illness. She died because the system that should have protected her instead armed her killer. She died because when badge-wearing officers break the rules, they get to resign quietly while their victims get buried forever. This isn't just the story of a murder. This is the story of institutional negligence so profound that it turned a neighborhood argument into a bloodbath. This is the story of how Denver police enabled a killer, then tried to hide their role in an innocent woman's death. Welcome to the Isabella Thallas case, where a dog walk became a death sentence, where police negligence became premeditation, and where the weapon that killed an innocent woman belonged to the very people sworn to serve and protect. June 10, 2020, 12:30 p.m. Ballpark neighborhood, Denver, Colorado. Isabella Thallas woke up that Wednesday morning with the same routine that had defined her young adult life. At 21 years old, she was building the foundation of her future, working, studying, and sharing a small apartment with her boyfriend Darian Simon in one of Denver's transitioning neighborhoods. Isabella wasn't just another young woman navigating life in the big city. She was a beacon of kindness in a world that seemed to be growing darker by the day. Friends described her as someone who lit up every room she entered, whose laugh could chase away the worst moods, whose compassion extended to every living creature she encountered. That compassion included Rocco, her beloved dog who had become the center of her daily routine. The morning routine that became a death march. Every day, Isabella and Darian would take Rocco for walks through their neighborhood near Coors Field. It was their time together, their escape from the stresses of work and life, their moment of peace in an increasingly chaotic world. The neighborhood itself was a study in contrasts. Historic buildings stood next to modern developments. Young professionals like Isabella and Darian lived alongside longtime residents who had watched the area transform over decades. It was gentrification in real time, with all the tensions that process creates. But on this particular morning, none of those broader social dynamics mattered to Isabella. She was simply a young woman in love, walking her dog, enjoying the sunshine, and looking forward to whatever the day might bring. She had no way of knowing that 400 yards away, a man was preparing to end her life with a weapon that should never have been in his possession. What makes the Isabella Thallas case so particularly heartbreaking is how normal everything was until it wasn't. This wasn't a woman who put herself in dangerous situations. This wasn't someone involved in risky behavior or criminal activity. This wasn't a case where we can point to warning signs or red flags that might have been heeded. Isabella Thallas was living the most ordinary life imaginable, and that ordinary life was about to be destroyed by extraordinary negligence. The psychological impact of random violence like this extends far beyond the immediate victims. When someone like Isabella, young, innocent, simply living her life, can be murdered for no reason while engaged in the most mundane activities, it shatters our collective sense of safety. If Isabella Thallas wasn't safe walking her dog in broad daylight in her own neighborhood, then none of us are safe anywhere. Isabella and Darian weren't just boyfriend and girlfriend. They were best friends building a life together. They had the kind of relationship that friends envied, the kind of partnership that made them both better people. Darian would later describe Isabella as his soulmate, the person who made him want to be the best version of himself. She challenged him intellectually, supported him emotionally, and brought joy to even the most ordinary moments. Their daily dog walks weren't just exercise for Rocco, they were quality time for a couple who were genuinely happy together. They would talk about their dreams, their plans, their hopes for the future. They would people watch, comment on the changing neighborhood, and simply enjoy being young and in love. On June 10, 2020, they were discussing their plans for the weekend. Isabella was excited about a project at work. Darian was telling her about something funny that had happened the day before. Normal conversation. Normal relationship. Normal life. Until Michael Close decided none of that mattered. Rocco wasn't just Isabella's pet, he was her companion, her source of daily joy, her excuse to get outside and exercise. The dog had been with Isabella through various life transitions, providing the kind of unconditional love that only animals can offer. On the morning of June 10th, Rocco was doing what dogs do. exploring his environment, following scents, and handling his biological needs wherever seemed appropriate to his canine sensibilities. What Rocco couldn't understand was that his natural behavior was about to trigger a chain of events that would destroy multiple lives and expose a system of institutional negligence that reached to the highest levels of Denver law enforcement. The tragic irony is that Rocco survived the shooting that killed his owner. The dog who inadvertently sparked Michael Close's rage outlived the woman who loved him, becoming a living reminder of senseless violence and preventable tragedy. 3 blocks from where Isabella Thallas was enjoying her morning walk, 36-year-old Michael Close was experiencing what forensic psychologists would later describe as a psychological pressure cooker reaching its breaking point. Close wasn't a stranger to Isabella and Darian. He was their neighbor, living in the same complex, sharing the same streets, occupying the same community space. But proximity doesn't create connection, and familiarity doesn't guarantee safety. Michael Close was a walking advertisement for the failures of America's mental health system, a man whose psychological issues had been documented, reported, and ignored until they finally exploded in the most catastrophic way possible. Understanding Michael Close requires understanding the psychology of men who kill over minor perceived slights. This isn't about mental illness in the traditional sense. It's about toxic masculinity, entitlement, and the dangerous combination of access to weapons and inability to regulate emotions. Close exhibited what forensic psychologists call pathological narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance combined with an inability to handle even minor challenges to his authority or comfort. When someone like Close encounters what he perceives as disrespect or inconvenience, his brain processes it not as a normal life interaction but as a personal attack requiring retaliation. The decision to kill Isabella Thallas wasn't made in the moment she walked by his apartment. It was the inevitable result of a psychological pattern that had been building for years, waiting for the right trigger and the right weapon. Court records and police reports paint a disturbing picture of Michael Close in the months and years leading up to Isabella's murder. This wasn't a man who suddenly snapped. This was a man whose capacity for violence had been escalating steadily, with warning signs that were either ignored or inadequately addressed by the system. Previous domestic violence incidents. Threatening behavior toward neighbors. Confrontations over minor issues that escalated to police involvement. A pattern of using intimidation and threats to resolve conflicts. Each incident was handled as an isolated event rather than part of a broader pattern of dangerous behavior. Police would respond, take reports, and move on, never connecting the dots that might have predicted the eventual tragedy. Most chilling of all, Close had specifically made previous threats about violence related to dogs and neighborhood disputes. Friends and neighbors would later recall conversations where Close had expressed disproportionate anger about pet-related issues, suggesting that the trigger for Isabella's murder had been building in his mind for months. Michael Close's psychological issues weren't secret. Family members had expressed concerns about his mental state. Previous girlfriends had reported his volatile behavior. Neighbors had complained about his aggressive responses to minor issues. But America's mental health system is designed to respond to crises, not prevent them. Unless someone is actively threatening immediate harm or demonstrating complete psychological breakdown, the system offers little intervention for people like Close who are dangerous but functional. The result is communities filled with ticking time bombs, people whose psychological issues make them prone to violence but who haven't yet crossed the legal threshold that would mandate treatment or intervention. Close had access to mental health resources. He had people in his life who recognized his issues. He had multiple opportunities to seek help or be connected with appropriate services. Instead, he had access to military-grade weapons and the explosive combination of entitlement and rage that would ultimately claim Isabella's life. Michael Close's apartment wasn't just his residence. It was his fortress, his castle, his sovereign territory that he defended with the intensity of someone protecting a national border. Neighbors would later describe Close as someone who treated every minor inconvenience as a personal attack on his domain. A dog barking, a child playing too loudly, a neighbor parking in what he considered his spot. All of these became evidence of disrespect requiring his intervention. The apartment complex where Close lived was typical of many urban developments, close quarters, shared spaces, and the inevitable conflicts that arise when diverse people with different lifestyles try to coexist in limited space. For most residents, these conflicts are minor annoyances to be navigated with patience, compromise, and basic human decency. For Michael Close, they were acts of war requiring increasingly aggressive responses. Inside Michael Close's apartment, investigators would later discover what could only be described as an arsenal. multiple firearms, ammunition, weapons maintenance equipment, and what appeared to be preparations for sustained conflict. This wasn't a gun enthusiast's collection or a hunter's tools. This was the armory of someone who had been preparing for violence and waiting for justification to use it. The presence of multiple weapons raises disturbing questions about Close's mindset and intentions. Why does someone living in a small apartment need access to military-grade firepower? What scenarios was he preparing for? What enemies was he expecting to face? The answer, tragically, was anyone who challenged his sense of control and authority over his environment. Neighbors walking their dogs. Children playing in shared spaces. Anyone whose normal life activities intersected with his pathological need for dominance. On the morning of June 10, 2020, Michael Close was already in an agitated state. Neighbors would later report hearing him talking angrily to himself, slamming doors, and displaying the kind of agitated behavior that had become his norm during periods of stress. When Isabella Thallas and Darian Simon appeared outside his window, walking their dog through what he considered his territory, Close's psychological pressure cooker finally reached its breaking point. But Michael Close didn't grab a baseball bat or his fists or even a handgun. He reached for the most deadly weapon in his arsenal, an AK-47 assault rifle that could kill multiple people with minimal effort. The choice of weapon reveals the depth of Close's homicidal intent. This wasn't about scaring someone or making a point. This was about killing and killing efficiently. Most chilling of all, the AK-47 that Michael Close used to murder Isabella Thallas didn't belong to him. It belonged to Denver Police Sergeant Daniel Politica. Denver Police Sergeant Daniel Politica wasn't just another cop with a gun problem. He was a sworn law enforcement officer who had taken an oath to protect and serve his community. He had undergone training in firearms safety, weapons security, and the responsibilities that come with access to deadly force. And he had given a military-grade assault rifle to a man with a documented history of violence and mental instability. The AK-47 that killed Isabella Thallas represents one of the most egregious examples of police negligence in recent American history. This wasn't an accidental shooting or a case of mistaken identity. This was institutional failure so profound that it directly enabled a preventable murder. The specifics of how Daniel Politica's AK-47 ended up in Michael Close's possession remain partially obscured by the Denver Police Department's refusal to fully cooperate with investigations. But what is known paints a picture of reckless disregard for public safety that rises to the level of criminal negligence. Police officers are trained extensively in weapons security. They understand that their firearms represent not just personal protection tools but instruments of state power that can cause irreparable harm if misused. The protocols for weapons storage, transfer, and accountability exist specifically to prevent situations like the Isabella Thallas murder. Sergeant Politica didn't just violate these protocols, he obliterated them. The AK-47 wasn't loaned to Close for hunting or sport shooting. It wasn't transferred through proper legal channels with background checks and documentation. It wasn't provided with safety training or supervision. It was simply given to a volatile man with a history of threats and violence, with no oversight, no accountability, and no consideration for the consequences. Understanding how Sergeant Politica could make such a catastrophically poor decision requires understanding the psychology of police culture and the sense of entitlement that often accompanies badge-wearing authority. Police officers exist in a unique position within society. They have legal authority to use force, access to weapons and resources unavailable to civilians, and a professional culture that often prioritizes loyalty to fellow officers over accountability to the public they serve. This culture can create a sense of invulnerability and entitlement that leads officers to believe normal rules don't apply to them. If Sergeant Politica wanted to loan a weapon to a friend, his position as a police officer might have made him feel immune to the consequences of that decision. The result is police officers who treat their professional resources as personal property, who blur the lines between official duties and private relationships, and who make decisions based on personal convenience rather than public safety. The relationship between Sergeant Politica and Michael Close wasn't professional, it was personal. They weren't connected through law enforcement duties or official police business. They were friends, and that friendship became the vehicle through which a police weapon entered the hands of a killer. Personal relationships between police officers and civilians aren't inherently problematic. But when those relationships involve the transfer of weapons, the sharing of official resources, or the blurring of professional boundaries, they become dangerous to public safety. Sergeant Politica's decision to loan his AK-47 to Close was based on personal trust rather than professional judgment. He saw Close as a friend rather than a potential threat. He prioritized personal loyalty over public safety. The result was a preventable murder that destroyed multiple lives and exposed the dangerous consequences of police officers who treat their professional responsibilities as personal privileges. The specific weapon used to kill Isabella Thallas wasn't a standard police sidearm or hunting rifle. It was an AK-47 assault rifle, a weapon designed for military combat, capable of firing high-velocity rounds at a rate that can kill multiple targets in seconds. Why did a Denver police sergeant own such a weapon? Why was it not secured in accordance with police department protocols? Why was it made available to someone outside law enforcement? These questions reveal broader issues within American policing, where officers often have access to military-grade weapons without corresponding accountability for their security and use. The AK-47 that killed Isabella represents the militarization of American police forces, a trend that has put weapons of war into the hands of people who may not have the training, judgment, or accountability necessary to handle them responsibly. When investigators began examining the murder weapon, they expected to trace it to Michael Close through normal civilian channels, gun stores, private sales, or theft reports. Instead, they discovered something far more disturbing. The weapon belonged to a sworn law enforcement officer. Ballistics evidence, serial number traces, and purchase records all led back to Sergeant Daniel Politica. The weapon that had killed an innocent woman wasn't stolen or acquired illegally, it was provided by a Denver police officer. This discovery transformed the Isabella Thallas case from a straightforward murder investigation into an examination of institutional negligence and police accountability. Suddenly, the Denver Police Department wasn't just investigating a crime, they were confronting evidence that one of their own officers had directly enabled that crime through reckless decision-making. When the connection between Sergeant Politica and the murder weapon became public, the Denver Police Department had a choice: acknowledge the systemic failures that had led to Isabella's death, or engage in damage control to protect the institution and the officer involved. They chose damage control. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation into how and why Politica had provided the weapon to Close, rather than examining whether similar negligence was occurring elsewhere in the department, rather than implementing reforms to prevent future tragedies, the department focused on minimizing liability and protecting their officer. The response included limiting media access to information about the case, restricting official statements about Politica's role, and allowing the sergeant to quietly resign rather than face disciplinary action or criminal charges. This institutional response reveals a police culture that prioritizes protecting officers over serving the public, even when that protection enables deadly negligence. When public pressure and media attention made Sergeant Politica's position untenable, he was allowed to resign from the Denver Police Department. The resignation was quiet, without fanfare, and with minimal public acknowledgement of his role in Isabella's death. Resignation allowed Politica to avoid the internal discipline, criminal investigation, and public accountability that his actions warranted. It allowed him to maintain his pension and benefits. Most importantly, it allowed the Denver Police Department to close the book on his case without admitting institutional responsibility for the tragedy he enabled. This pattern of allowing police officers to resign rather than face consequences for their actions is endemic in American law enforcement. It protects individual officers from accountability while perpetuating the systemic failures that make tragedies like Isabella's death inevitable. Sergeant Politica's resignation wasn't justice. It was institutional self-preservation at the expense of public safety.
It's okay, we'll clean it.
"12:47 p.m. The moment everything changed. Isabella Thallas and Darian Simon were walking north on the 2900 block of North Fox Street, their usual route through the ballpark neighborhood. Rocco was doing what dogs do: sniffing, exploring, and relieving himself as the mood struck. They were 50 feet from Michael Close's apartment when Rocco defecated near a tree close to the building. It was the kind of minor incident that happens thousands of times every day in every urban neighborhood across America. A dog answering nature's call while his owners continued their walk. For Isabella and Darian, it was a moment so insignificant they barely noticed it. For Michael Close, watching from his apartment window, it was a declaration of war. What happened next exposes the terrifying reality of how quickly normal interactions can become deadly when they involve someone whose psychological makeup makes them prone to extreme violence. Close appeared at his window and began screaming at Isabella and Darian about the dog. His language was profane, aggressive, and completely disproportionate to the situation. He wasn't asking them to clean up after their pet or expressing reasonable concern about neighborhood cleanliness. He was expressing rage, dominance, and a level of entitlement that suggested he viewed the entire neighborhood as his personal property. Isabella and Darian's response was what any reasonable person's would be. They tried to defuse the situation. Darian offered to clean up after the dog. Isabella attempted to calm Close down. They were dealing with what they assumed was an angry neighbor having a bad day. They had no way of knowing they were dealing with a killer who had access to military-grade weapons and the psychological profile of someone for whom minor slights justified homicide. What Michael Close did next reveals the calculated nature of his actions and destroys any suggestion that Isabella's murder was a crime of passion or temporary insanity. Close didn't grab the nearest object to throw or use his fists or even reach for a handgun. He walked away from the window, went to wherever he stored Sergeant Politica's AK-47, retrieved the weapon, loaded it, and returned to a position where he could kill Isabella and Darian. This sequence of actions, window confrontation, weapon retrieval, loading, positioning, took at least several minutes. It was time enough for Close's anger to cool, for his rational mind to reassert control, for him to consider the consequences of his actions. Instead, he used that time to prepare for murder. The forensic psychology of this sequence is crucial to understanding both Close's culpability and the preventable nature of Isabella's death. This wasn't a split-second decision made in the heat of passion. This was a deliberate choice to escalate a minor neighborhood dispute to lethal violence. When Michael Close returned to his firing position with the AK-47, Isabella Thallas and Darian Simon were still in the area where the confrontation had begun. They weren't threatening him, weren't approaching his apartment, weren't doing anything that could be construed as aggressive or dangerous. Isabella was 21 years old, weighed approximately 120 pounds, and was armed with nothing more threatening than a dog leash. She posed no physical threat to Close, no danger to his property, no challenge to his safety. Close aimed the assault rifle and fired. The single shot struck Isabella in the back, the high-velocity round from the AK-47 causing massive internal damage that killed her almost instantly. She collapsed on the sidewalk where she had been walking, her life ending in the most senseless, preventable way imaginable. Darian Simon watched the woman he loved die in his arms, her blood staining the concrete of a neighborhood where she had felt safe enough to walk her dog in broad daylight. Michael Close's behavior immediately after shooting Isabella reveals crucial information about his psychological state and the calculated nature of his actions. He didn't rush to help Isabella or attempt to provide medical assistance. He didn't call 911 or express remorse for what he had done. He didn't surrender to police or show any sign of recognizing the gravity of his actions. Instead, he calmly secured the weapon and prepared for the police response he knew was coming. This behavior pattern is consistent with what forensic psychologists call instrumental violence, killing that serves a specific purpose for the perpetrator rather than resulting from emotional overwhelm or psychological breakdown. Close had used violence to assert dominance, to punish what he perceived as disrespect, and to establish his control over his environment. Isabella's death wasn't a tragic accident or the result of mental illness. It was the logical outcome of his entitled, narcissistic worldview. By the time police and paramedics arrived at the scene, Isabella Thallas was beyond help. The massive trauma caused by the AK-47 round had killed her within minutes of impact, her young life ending on a sidewalk where she had been doing nothing more dangerous than walking her dog. Darian Simon was in psychological shock, covered in his girlfriend's blood, trying to process the incomprehensible reality that the woman he loved had been murdered for no reason by a neighbor he barely knew. The first responders who arrived at the scene were professional and competent, but they were responding to a tragedy that should never have happened, a murder enabled by the negligence of their own colleagues in law enforcement. The irony was devastating. Denver police officers were investigating a murder committed with a weapon provided by a Denver police sergeant. Michael Close didn't attempt to flee or resist arrest. He surrendered quietly, without drama or violence, exhibiting none of the psychological instability that might excuse his actions or suggest diminished capacity. His calm demeanor during arrest and booking was consistent with someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to face the consequences. This wasn't a man in the grip of uncontrollable rage or psychological breakdown. This was a killer who had gotten what he wanted: dominance, control, and the satisfaction of punishing someone who had dared to inconvenience him. The physical evidence from Isabella's murder painted a clear picture of what had happened and demolished any possible claim of self-defense or justified violence. The trajectory of the bullet showed Isabella had been shot in the back while walking away from Close's apartment. She wasn't advancing toward him or threatening him in any way. She was trying to leave the area and defuse the confrontation. The ballistics evidence confirmed the weapon was an AK-47, a military-grade assault rifle completely inappropriate for civilian use and capable of inflicting the kind of massive trauma that had killed Isabella. Most importantly, the forensic analysis of the crime scene showed no evidence that Isabella or Darian had posed any threat to close. No weapons were found near their bodies. No evidence of aggressive behavior or threatening gestures. Isabella had been executed for the crime of being in Michael Close's field of view while walking her dog. Forensic psychologists who studied the Isabella Thallas case identified it as a textbook example of what they call instrumental aggression, violence used to achieve specific goals rather than resulting from emotional overwhelm. Close's goals were clear: establish dominance over his environment, punish perceived disrespect, and demonstrate his power to control life and death in his territory. The murder was preventable at multiple levels. If Close had received appropriate mental health intervention for his documented history of threats and violence. If he hadn't had access to military-grade weapons. If Sergeant Politica had followed proper protocols for weapons security. If the Denver Police Department had adequate oversight of officers' weapons and equipment. Each of these failures contributed to creating the conditions that made Isabella's murder not just possible but inevitable. When Michael Close's murder trial began, prosecutors faced what should have been one of the easiest cases in Colorado legal history. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive was clear, and the defendant had killed an innocent woman in broad daylight for no defensible reason. The physical evidence alone was enough to convict. Ballistics matching the murder weapon to Close's possession, trajectory analysis proving Isabella was shot while walking away, witness testimony from Darian Simon describing the confrontation and shooting. But the prosecutors also had something more powerful: the moral clarity of a case where an innocent woman had been murdered by a neighbor whose sense of entitlement had escalated to homicide. This should have been a straightforward conviction followed by a life sentence, providing some measure of justice for Isabella's family and closure for a community traumatized by senseless violence. Michael Close's defense team faced an impossible task, explaining how their client's actions could be justified or excused in any legal or moral framework. Their strategy revealed the bankruptcy of a legal system that allows even the most obviously guilty defendants to waste time and resources on frivolous defenses that insult the intelligence of juries and dishonor victims' memories. Close's attorneys argued that he had been defending himself and his property from perceived threats. They suggested that his mental health issues diminished his culpability. They attempted to portray Isabella and Darian as somehow responsible for their own victimization. Each of these arguments was demolished by the evidence, but their presentation prolonged a trial that should have been concluded quickly and definitively. Darian Simon's testimony was the emotional and factual centerpiece of the trial. As the only surviving witness to Isabella's murder, his account provided the jury with a moment-by-moment reconstruction of how a normal dog walk became a scene of horrific violence. Simon described Isabella as a woman full of life and kindness, someone whose response to Close's initial aggression was to try to calm the situation rather than escalate it. He testified about her final moments, about watching her die, about the senseless nature of her murder. But Simon's testimony also revealed crucial details about Close's behavior that proved premeditation and demolished any claim of self-defense. The time Close took to retrieve the weapon, his calculated positioning, his complete lack of remorse, all of it painted a picture of deliberate murder rather than impulsive violence. While the trial focused on Michael Close's guilt, the evidence also revealed the institutional negligence that had enabled Isabella's murder. The AK-47's ownership by Sergeant Politica was established through ballistics and documentation, but the full extent of police department failures remained largely unexplored. This selective prosecution revealed a troubling pattern in American criminal justice. Individual killers face full accountability while the institutional failures that enable their crimes remain largely unexamined. The Denver Police Department's role in Isabella's death should have been a central focus of the trial, but prosecutorial discretion and institutional protection limited the scope of accountability to Close alone. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found Michael Close guilty of first-degree murder, a verdict that reflected both the strength of the evidence and the moral clarity of the case. The speed of the verdict suggested that jurors had no difficulty seeing through the defense's attempts to justify or excuse Close's actions. They recognized Isabella's murder for what it was: the deliberate killing of an innocent woman by a neighbor whose entitlement and access to weapons had created a deadly combination. The guilty verdict provided some measure of justice for Isabella's family and friends, but it couldn't restore the life that had been stolen or address the institutional failures that had made her murder possible. Michael Close was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under Colorado law. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crime and the complete absence of mitigating factors that might have justified mercy. During sentencing, Isabella's family and friends were finally able to address Close directly, describing the impact of his actions and the life he had stolen. Their statements painted a picture of a young woman whose potential had been unlimited and whose death had left an unfillable void in countless lives. Close showed no remorse during sentencing, maintaining the same entitled attitude that had led to Isabella's murder. His lack of empathy or responsibility confirmed that the life sentence was both appropriate and necessary to protect society from his capacity for violence. While Michael Close's conviction and life sentence provided closure to the criminal case, it didn't address the broader institutional failures that had enabled Isabella's murder. Sergeant Politica faced no criminal charges for providing the murder weapon to Close. The Denver Police Department implemented no meaningful reforms to prevent similar negligence in the future. The systemic issues that had contributed to Isabella's death remained largely unaddressed. This selective accountability is typical of American responses to institutional failure. Individual bad actors are punished while the systems that enable them remain largely unchanged. True justice for Isabella Thallas would require not just punishing her killer but addressing the police negligence that had armed him and the institutional culture that had protected those responsible. While Michael Close was facing criminal prosecution for Isabella's murder, her family was pursuing a parallel track of accountability through the civil justice system. Their wrongful death lawsuit targeted not just Close but the institutional negligence that had enabled his crime. The civil case revealed details about police department failures that hadn't been fully explored during the criminal trial. It exposed the depth of Sergeant Politica's negligence and the Denver Police Department's efforts to minimize their liability for Isabella's death. Most importantly, it provided Isabella's family with a forum to hold accountable not just her killer but the system that had armed him. The lawsuit named multiple defendants: Michael Close for the murder itself, Sergeant Daniel Politica for providing the weapon, and the Denver Police Department for failing to properly supervise their officer and his equipment. Each defendant employed different strategies to avoid accountability. Close's attorneys argued that civil liability was inappropriate given the criminal proceedings. Politica's representatives claimed his actions were outside the scope of his employment and therefore not the responsibility of the police department. Most cynically, the Denver Police Department argued that Politica's decision to loan his weapon to Close was a personal choice unrelated to his professional duties, absolving the institution of any responsibility for the consequences. The civil discovery process, where attorneys can demand documents and testimony from defendants, revealed the extent of institutional failures within the Denver Police Department. Internal documents showed that Politica's weapons handling had raised concerns among colleagues before Isabella's murder. There were indications that his friendship with Close was known to supervisors and that his decision-making regarding department resources had been questioned. Most damaging were communications between police department officials after Isabella's murder, showing a coordinated effort to minimize institutional liability rather than address the systemic failures that had enabled the tragedy. Discovery revealed that Sergeant Politica's loan of his AK-47 to Close wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of cavalier attitude toward weapons security and department resources. Internal records showed multiple instances where Politica had failed to follow proper protocols for equipment handling. There were indications that other officers had raised concerns about his judgment and reliability. Most troubling were suggestions that the police department had been aware of these issues but had failed to take corrective action that might have prevented Isabella's death. As the civil case progressed, it became clear that the Denver Police Department's response to Isabella's murder had been focused more on damage control than accountability. Internal communications revealed a coordinated effort to minimize the department's legal exposure while avoiding meaningful examination of the systemic failures that had enabled the tragedy. This cover-up mentality extended from the highest levels of department leadership down to the officers directly involved. Rather than acknowledging mistakes and implementing reforms, the institution chose to protect itself at the expense of justice for Isabella's family. The cover-up included limiting media access to information about Politica's role, allowing Politica to resign quietly rather than face disciplinary action, restricting official statements about department policies and procedures, coordinating legal strategies to minimize institutional liability. After months of legal proceedings that had exposed embarrassing details about police department negligence, the case was quietly settled out of court. The terms of the settlement were sealed, preventing the public from knowing the full extent of the financial compensation or the specific admissions of liability. The sealed settlement served multiple purposes for the defendants. It avoided a public trial that would have further exposed institutional failures. It prevented the establishment of legal precedent that might have encouraged similar lawsuits. It allowed all parties to avoid detailed public examination of their actions. Most importantly, it bought the silence of Isabella's family regarding the specific details of police negligence. While the settlement provided financial compensation to Isabella's family, it also ensured that the full truth about institutional failures would remain hidden from public view. Sergeant Daniel Politica's resignation from the Denver Police Department was timed to coincide with the settlement negotiations, suggesting a coordinated strategy to minimize his exposure to both criminal prosecution and civil liability. The resignation allowed Politica to avoid internal disciplinary proceedings that might have resulted in termination for cause, maintain his pension and benefits earned during his police career, escape detailed public examination of his decision-making and judgment, prevent the establishment of precedent for holding police officers accountable for weapons negligence. Most importantly, the resignation allowed the Denver Police Department to close the book on Politica's case without admitting systemic failures or implementing meaningful reforms. The Denver Police Department's response to Isabella's murder revealed an institution more concerned with protecting its reputation than preventing future tragedies. Rather than conducting a comprehensive review of weapons policies, officer supervision, and equipment security, the department focused on limiting liability and managing public relations. Rather than implementing reforms that might have prevented similar negligence, they allowed the officer responsible to resign quietly and fade from public attention. Rather than acknowledging the institutional failures that had enabled Isabella's murder, they treated it as an isolated incident unrelated to broader systemic issues. This response pattern is typical of police departments across America when confronted with evidence of institutional negligence: protect the institution, minimize accountability, and resist meaningful reform. Isabella Thallas wasn't just a murder victim. She was a daughter, girlfriend, friend, and community member whose life had value that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. At 21, Isabella was at the beginning of what should have been decades of contribution to her community, her family, and the world around her. She was studying, working, building relationships, and developing the skills and experience that would have defined her adult life. Her friends described someone with an infectious laugh, unlimited kindness, and the kind of optimism that makes everyone around her feel better about life. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, who offered help without being asked, who brightened rooms simply by entering them. Isabella's relationship with Darian wasn't just young love. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. They were planning a future together, discussing dreams and goals, building the foundation for a life that would have included marriage, children, career success, and decades of shared experiences. All of that potential was destroyed by a neighbor's entitled rage and a police officer's negligent decision-making. Darian Simon survived Isabella's murder physically, but the psychological trauma of watching the woman he loved die in his arms has affected every aspect of his life since June 10, 2020. Post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't begin to describe the impact of witnessing such senseless violence. Darian has had to rebuild his entire understanding of safety, trust, and meaning in a world where innocent people can be murdered for walking their dogs. The survivor's guilt, wondering if he could have done something different, if he could have protected Isabella, if his presence somehow contributed to the tragedy, has required extensive therapy and support from family and friends. Darian has also had to navigate the criminal justice system as a witness, reliving the trauma of Isabella's murder through testimony, depositions, and court proceedings that extended the pain of loss over years rather than allowing healing to begin. Most tragically, Darian has had to build a new life without the person who had been his partner in creating that life. Every milestone, every holiday, every ordinary day is marked by Isabella's absence and the future they will never share. Isabella's family, parents, siblings, extended relatives, lost not just a loved one but their faith in the systems designed to protect innocent people. Her parents raised a daughter who followed all the rules, made good choices, and lived responsibly, only to watch her be murdered for no reason by a system failure that should never have occurred. Her siblings lost the sister who would have been part of their lives for decades to come, the aunt their children will never meet, the family member who would have celebrated their successes and supported them through challenges. The extended family lost the young woman who brought joy to gatherings, who connected generations, who represented hope and potential for the family's future. Their grief is compounded by the knowledge that Isabella's death was completely preventable and that the institutional failures responsible have faced minimal accountability. Isabella's murder affected far more than her immediate family and friends. The entire ballpark neighborhood was traumatized by the reality that someone could be murdered while walking their dog in broad daylight. Neighbors who had felt safe in their community suddenly found themselves questioning every interaction, every stranger, every moment of vulnerability that urban living requires. The knowledge that the murder weapon had been provided by a police officer, someone sworn to protect the community, added another layer of violation and mistrust. Parents stopped allowing children to play unsupervised. Dog owners changed their walking routes. Residents installed additional security measures and limited their outdoor activities. The institutional failure that enabled Isabella's murder didn't just kill one person, it poisoned an entire community's sense of safety and trust. Every murder creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate victim, but preventable murders like Isabella's create additional layers of trauma and loss. Her co-workers lost a colleague whose presence had made their workplace more enjoyable and productive. Her classmates lost a study partner and friend whose potential contributions to their field will never be realized. Her community lost a young person who would have volunteered, voted, participated in civic life, and contributed to the social fabric that makes neighborhoods strong. Most broadly, society lost another example of how institutional negligence and individual entitlement can combine to destroy innocent lives and terrorize communities. True justice for Isabella Thallas requires more than punishing Michael Close or providing financial compensation to her family. It requires addressing the institutional failures that enabled her murder and preventing similar tragedies in the future. That justice would include criminal prosecution of Sergeant Politica for his role in providing the murder weapon, comprehensive reform of police weapons policies and oversight, meaningful accountability for police supervisors who failed to prevent the negligence, community healing programs to address the broader trauma caused by institutional failure, systemic changes to prevent similar preventable tragedies. The fact that most of these elements of justice remain unaddressed means that Isabella's death has not yet received the response it deserves.